Morning, everyone. Yes, no? Good morning. Hey. Hello, and welcome to Charting the Future of Financial Aid. I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed. Great to be with all of you. Our time together is short, and I'm surrounded by very smart and knowledgeable people, so I'm going to tee things up very quickly, only by saying that the federal and state spending on student financial aid has increased drastically in recent decades as the complexity of this constellation of programs and those factors, along with the rising college prices and debt, have inevitably and understandably resulted in greater questioning of the efficacy of that spending and of this ecosystem. We're going to try to cover an almost ridiculous amount of ground in 40 minutes. They suggested we look back 50 or 60 years, and we're thinking, no, I think we'll mostly focus on looking ahead, but we're going to have to talk a little bit about how we got here. But to make sure you and we start from the same basic point of understanding, I'm going to start with Beth Akers, who's one of our panelists, is going to sort of give us a quick walk through this ecosystem of federal financial aid. Joined also, before we get to Beth, she's on the far right, Yolanda Watson Spiva, president of Complete College America, and Stephen Taylor, Postsecondary Education Fellow with Stand Together Trust. You're up here with me, but I'm going to turn it over to Beth to start.
Good morning. My name is Beth Akers, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also an economist. So if you're coming to this conversation a little bit fresh into the higher education space, let me introduce you. We started with a conversation largely about K-12 education, which is a system in which the federal government, state governments are largely controlling the system. What's the defining characteristic that makes higher education different, in my perspective, is that we largely operate it as a marketplace. And one of the important ways in which governments intervene in this marketplace is through financial aid. So we subsidized institutions and education in lots of different ways. Department of Labor subsidizes workforce training in lots of different ways. But the critical one that we're going to be talking about today is the manner in which we intervene through what's called financial aid. So in essence, if you're more familiar with K-12, this is sort of a supersized voucher program, giving the dollars to the individuals to let them choose where they spend. So initially, this was a somewhat simple program. It has grown into a dizzying array of options and systems. Doug recently called this a mousetrap of options that we have in the current system today. But you can get most of the way there if you appreciate that there are three main ways in which we're subsidizing students directly. The Pell Grant program, which is a means-tested system of giving cash to students that they can spend at accredited institutions. The GI Bill, which is dollars that are for our former servicemen and women to use on their institutions. And lastly, and probably most complexly, the lending program. We subsidize loans through interest rates, but also through generous terms of repayment on those loans, or non-repayment, which we're not going to focus on entirely today. I'll stop there, because I think that catches us at least to a starting point where we can have a good conversation together.
And we'll refine that as we go. But basically want to start by asking each of our these folks up here about what they perceive to be the greatest strength and the greatest weakness or failure to date of this Byzantine array of policies and programs. Yolanda, maybe start with you.
Sure, thank you. So I think one of the
just a quick, let them know who you are, where you come from a little.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Sure. I'm with the president of Complete College America, Yolanda Watson Spiva. We're based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we are an alliance of 49 state systems and consortia, all of whom either the governor or the system head has signed on to say we want to increase completion rates on behalf of this nation. So thank you for having me. So one of the greatest benefits or strengths of the program is really that it is purported to create access. And what we've been trying to do for the past, say, 30 or so years is really increase the ability for anyone to be able to access higher education. Also, however, that's one of the greatest weaknesses of the program, because it actually does not facilitate as much diversity and access as it purports to do. Because sometimes for things that students are really, in terms of social and economic mobility, when we think about programs like work study, for example, students are really relegated to some of the lowest paid and lowest option programs that they're doing work in, as opposed to work that's aligned with their major that will actually facilitate social and economic mobility for them in terms of accessing employment beyond the baccalaureate degree, but then also once they're out into the workforce. And so at the same time that it's facilitating access, it also hinders it. And so thinking about how this Byzantine way of thinking about aid can be improved is one of the ways that I think we can have a conversation about today.
Stephen.
Yeah, so Steve Taylor, I'm a senior fellow on post-secondary education at Stand Together Trust. We're a philanthropy focused on removing barriers so that every individual can realize their full potential. When I think about the weaknesses and the strengths, I'm going to start with the weakness. I think it's this hugely complex system that actually, it's a carrot through funding with so many sticks, which actually limits the options for students, especially those for whom a college pathway or a college degree is not the best maybe first option. Another option that can maybe stack into a degree later would be a better option, but they're locked into that college pathway, especially when they're low-income individuals and they're relying on the federal Pell Grant. The strength, however, is that it's a decentralized system in that states are funding, private actors are funding, the federal government's funding, and that opens up an opportunity for innovation and funding sources when we start to think about braiding workforce funding and post-secondary education funding. There are myriad solutions that we can look to.
Beth, I want to give you a chance to offer your strength and weakness.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have succeeded in a big way in democratizing higher education through the resources that are available. Not to say there isn't still a long way to go. I mean, in theory, the dollars are available to make the price tag affordable for pretty much anyone in this country to go to college. There are lots of other barriers beyond the price tag which are standing in the way, and maybe more dollars would help with those barriers as well. In terms of what are the drawbacks, the thing I'm probably most concerned about is that in order for students to access these dollars, they need to go to a program of study that looks like college. And so if college has to look like college in order to be eligible for this, I think that we're stifling innovation in terms of what institutions are able to do, what programs we're able to offer. We still celebrate the 4-year degree as the standard of education in this country. Why can't a bachelor's degree be 4 years? Or why can't we have something else that's 3 years or 2 years and be celebrating those things as well? In large part, it's because of the fact that these colleges need to look like colleges in order to play ball in the system of federal student aid.
So we are, I would argue, starting to see that change slowly. Well, a bunch of factors. We had Governor Hogan talk before about Maryland becoming one of the first of what are now 9 states that have stopped requiring the bachelor's degree for a lot of their programs. So this is an ecosystem, both higher education and federal student aid, that probably doesn't change unless it has to and unless there are pressures. And we've obviously seen significantly increasing pressures on that, both in terms of, again, student debt, the sort of growing doubts about the extent to which graduates and people who've been through the ecosystem are prepared for work. So I guess digging into the sort of issues you all raised, Yolanda, I want to start with you. I mean, your view is basically that we had this goal of access, and it is different from how a lot of countries are set up. I mean, the U.S. got on board early with the idea that post-secondary education was something that many people, most people, all people ideally should have access to. And it seems like you're saying that's both the great strength and we're underperforming. What do you consider to be the sort of key reasons we're underperforming in terms of equity of access?
Geez, well, I think a big part of it is that people don't understand the complexity of the problem, and so especially students and families, and so we make it difficult from completing the FAFSA, which we've simplified some, but it still could be even more simplified, especially for individuals who come out of for example, foster care or other systems that create barriers for them. How do we make it so that essentially you would have to opt out as opposed to opt in to financial aid? And also sometimes even at the institutional level, there's not a real understanding of how to create more access for students. It really is about almost like holding on to the dollars as opposed to making sure as many students as possible are able to access them. And so getting the institutional actors to understand this is not about keeping the dollars under your coffers. It really is about trying to create access. So I think those are the two ways. The other thing, though, for families is trying to debunk a lot of the myths around what you have to do to actually get the dollars. There's so much red tape that goes into actually accessing the dollars, and for families to understand the terminology, satisfactory academic progress once you get the dollars. I mean, there's so many different things that students have to understand and be able to do in order to retain the dollars. And then when can you take the courses? Is summer Pell, are you eligible for that? If you do a certain type of program, as you said. So there's so many different things, and the regulations and the statutes are so complex that it just creates more difficulty. And so if we can find a way to demystify, debunk a lot of the theories around financial aid, but also create terminologies that are accessible to students and families, I think that'll help tremendously.
Beth, both you and Steve kind of focused your critique about the current system on its failure to enable students, learners to go to seek alternative credentials from alternative providers. What are the impediments to that in the current ecosystem, and what suggestions do you have about how we might address that?
Well, right now, in order to access federal student aid dollars, an institution has to have accreditation. And accreditation is a process that's run by these third-party institutions that say, yes, you are what looks like a college to me, and so therefore you can get money that's set aside for college students. And so I think we need to broaden what accreditation means. I mean, to be radical, I would say let's do away with accreditation altogether and start looking at what works and see what institutions, what programs, what training pathways are succeeding in getting people the outcomes they want, which we know is a job, and then start sending money that way. But I'll step back and say, too, I think in terms of where we should be heading with the financial aid system, I see as kind of a core challenge that college is still risky for young people. And so if we could take the risk out of that through our financial aid dollars, rather than trying to make it free, but make it less risky. And maybe that sounds a little abstract, but when we think about our lending programs and the dollars we spend there, I want to make sure that we're subsidizing people who go to college but don't get that huge payoff that we know many people do get when they go to college. So a little out of order there, but I'll throw it back to you.
Well, just the one thing, the financial aid dollars, the reason we have an accreditation system, whether it's successful or not, is that the federal government's role is, and there's a balancing act here between accessibility and quality. And I imagine if you asked the public about accreditation, virtually nobody would know even what you're talking about. I don't know what would happen if you asked the people in this room or more broadly, but we need some measure of quality in higher education. Quality has been an elusive concept in higher education. We don't have good tools for gauging it. So Steve, I'm going to give you a chance to answer that same question about sort of the alternative providers and your vision for that, for sort of how to sort of address that flaw or your perceived weakness there.
Yeah, so I'll say something and maybe we'll get some jaws dropped, but I think for many years we've engaged in what I'd call education malpractice. We have prescribed a solution to so many students that has left them worse off than had they not gone to college. They've acquired debt, they've left without a credential, they're now on the marketplace, they are in maybe not even a family sustaining wage. So we have left them worse off, and college should not do that. Our post-secondary strategy in the country should not leave individuals worse off as a result of pursuing education. And so I think the way we start to counter that is we create a more open marketplace where there is pressure on colleges to decrease cost, be more innovative, decrease that time to completion, right? And start recognizing credit for prior learning, recognize the experiences that people bring and help them decrease the cost and time by giving them that credit. In terms of the alternatives, I think accreditors play a key role here, both a protectionist role, so they are essentially protecting a system of about 4,000 plus institutions. It's hard to become a new institution or a new provider in that space. And if we can provide an on-ramp for new providers that are lower cost, that are industry aligned, that provide these shorter term credentials that are high value to individuals to use those federal dollars to pursue, it puts pressure on colleges to deliver better ROI as well.
What does quality assurance look like in an ecosystem like that? Especially, well, Beth, maybe especially if we got rid of accreditation. I don't know if you were actually advocating that. I didn't get the
As a
sense.
thought exercise.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, I guess that is an important role. Yolanda, I don't know if you have thoughts on sort of what a better way of ensuring that the federal dollars are being used well might look like.
Well, as a former auditor for the U.S. Department of Education, Financial Aid Office, I have strong feelings about why it's in place, and because I've seen what bad really looks like in real time. And so there are some bad actors out there or individuals who misappropriate the federal dollars, and it's important that we safeguard those for our public. So I think it's an important function, but I do believe sometimes we can engage in overreach or an overextension or broadening of the scope. And so making sure we're staying very clear about what the purpose of accreditation is, and then also the proper and appropriate use of those dollars. I will say, however, that if we can also make sure that the purpose of financial aid is also around completion, because to your point about the individuals who are leaving with some credit, no degree, and then of course don't have the ROI for their own benefit in terms of in the marketplace of employment, it's important that we think about ways that financial aid can facilitate completion. I talked about the access side. Of course, as president of Complete College America, we are focused on completion. And so thinking about how financial aid unfortunately almost punishes you if you're not taking a straight line to a baccalaureate degree. It does not allow for life to happen, which for most of our learners, life happens because they're living their lives. And so if we can think about ways that the financial aid system, as complex as it already is, can really begin to think about how do we keep students engaged in the higher education endeavor and not punish them for being engaged in life. Beth?
You know, I think this conversation sort of bumps into a philosophical discussion of what is education for? Because when we think about what is quality, now I'm an economist, so I'm going to tell you it's about dollars and cents. That is, do the graduates go on to make enough money such that they're paying back their loans readily to justify the upfront cost? I'll also concede that there are social returns to education that are trickier to measure, but you know that pushes me towards wanting to think that we should be judging institutions, judging outcomes in terms of like, are people succeeding financially in the long run? And that's not what we're doing today. We have kind of a subjective measure of, is this a good college? Are the faculty a good faculty? Is the course structure a good course structure? And that worries me.
Well, I think, and I'll just jump in there, the accountability measures that we have don't actually hold all institutions accountable for delivering positive ROI and good outcomes to students. Accreditation, largely based on a set of inputs. Yes, you've got the volumes in the library. Yes, your faculty have the right credentials. Accreditors were never really meant to be the arbiters of employment outcomes and post-graduation outcomes. They were focused on completion. What happened to a student after they completed their credential was not in the purview of an accreditor. And now we've got lawmakers and we've got the Department of Education saying, hey, accreditors, you know, we want to give you this opportunity to expand your scope and start to focus on accountability around post-completion outcomes. That's not what they were designed for. And so if we think about really measuring these post-graduation or post-completion outcomes tied to earnings, tied to ROI, we need a new type of accreditation. We need folks and organizations and innovators to stand up and say, we have the measures. We work with employers. We've got employer-validated models, not sort of a group of academics that have been sitting in these institutions for decades called accreditors that are faculty that go out and review other faculty and institutions. It's just not working. And so we don't have to blow it up, but we do need something different. And there are innovative models out there that are starting to form that are focused on these more employment and post-completion outcomes. And we really should look to create this space for experimentation with these models and allow them to prove themselves out and compete with traditional accreditation.
And federal policy changed a few years ago to enable the emergence of more and different accreditors. It's a slowly unfolding process, but it is in place. Yolanda, you look like you
I just wanted to add, Doug, that to your point, also higher education was not built for employment. Initially, it was about a upper class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male being able to have, access to being erudite and to, really just prove that they were of a certain class. And so higher education was not built about getting employment outcomes. So when we think about the changes over the past 50, 60 years, which were really about having people move into the middle class or beyond, that's a very new concept. And so the concept of access and completion for employment outcomes, we have to really now create this pathway that includes employment and post-secondary as a pathway completely, not two separate sectors. And I think that's where we're still battling because they're doing this as opposed to doing this. And so if we can think about how we now change the goal and the role of post-secondary education to lead to post-secondary employment outcomes, post-baccalaureate outcomes, I think we're going to have a better conversation.
Two things I would just say. I totally agree. I would try in conversations like this to try to be the voice of saying we can't make it all about employment. I worry that if we do that, we will, as a society, we will fail. I think as a minimum bar, and that's really the federal government's role, is to sort of set a minimum sort of acceptable outcome for I think employment ought to be central. But I think if we are judging institutions solely by outcome, financial outcome, there are dangers that come with that. Yeah, Beth.
I think something that illustrates this point, that there's this tension between what institutions believe they do, what policymakers think they do, and what students think they do. Surveys show that over 90% of students report that earning a better salary is their number one motivation for going colleges. And then at the same time, if you look at mission statements of institutions, they're very often things like, we aim to create global citizens, or things like these very lofty ambitions. And there just seems to be a disconnect. Now, there are definitely institutions who are changing gears here, or even institutions that were designed around this initially to create employment relationships and are succeeding in really doing that. But the system doesn't, at the moment, incentivize that type of behavior, I think, as much as it should. And I do believe that the distribution of financial aid dollars, which is really the primary way that we subsidize, intervene in this marketplace, should be more focused on this question. And like Doug said, this doesn't need to go all the way. Employment is not the only objective, of course. Right. Even the nasty economists on the panel will concede to that point to you all. But I think that there's so much room to go in that direction before we get into trouble.
And Doug, we talked a couple years ago when I put out this paper for ACE on linking life and career relevance in the classroom. For faculty, this isn't about you're now becoming a job training preparation professional. Faculty identity is tied in that academic component, tied into the liberal arts. And so asking faculty to tap into that passion, that expertise in their discipline, and help students make the explicit connections to non-academic settings, life and career relevance, is how they can help improve students' post-graduation employment outcomes. It's not saying, history student, we're going to teach you how to go become a museum curator. We're going to prepare you with the skills or equip you with the skills so that you can go out and be an adaptive citizen and essentially kind of roll with the tide. So during the pandemic, we wrote this paper to say, actually just pre-pandemic, we need to prepare adaptable individuals that can go out and craft these jobs and opportunities in their lives. And the reason we're talking about this on a financial aid panel is because financial aid is the carrot for which we can have all sorts of sticks attached, and accountability around post-completion outcomes is one of those sticks.
So Beth did a great job making this ecosystem sound really simple. If this was a whiteboard and we started drawing on it, we have federal, state, we have, as Yolanda said, we have sort of financial aid aimed at sort of traditional institutions. Then there's the whole workforce, a whole separate set of streams of funding. And I guess when I think about this sort of thorny potential problem, is it refashioning this ecosystem? Is it a reasonable goal? And what is it? How do you start? Is it something that can be iterated toward? I think that to sort of reduce the complexity, not of the form that we talked about, FAFSA simplification, but that's it's on the margins. Beth, I'm curious, as you think
Yeah.
about this, sort of how much simpler could it be and still achieve the multiple purposes?
A lot of the complexity in the system is completely unnecessary, and it's a product of the political process rather than any sort of strategic planning. So we haven't had a full reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and I don't even remember how many years
15.
now. 15, thank you. But that's the time when we rethink and make big fundamental changes to the system. Instead of doing that to reform the system to keep pace with the needs of our society today, we've made incremental change piecemeal through legislation and very often through executive action. And the result is that we're building pieces onto an existing framework that become redundant with slightly different parameters. I think someone was telling me yesterday in the lending program there are 12 different loan programs. I don't even know them all, and it's my day job to know these things. I made it sound simple because I can't remember all the pieces, to be honest with you. But it's incredibly complex, and a lot of it is entirely unnecessary. If Congress were able to pass legislation, I believe there is bipartisan support for the notion of simplification, and there is no justification for having 12 different lending programs. But the political process has us stuck in this moment where we're unable to pass legislation that would be required to make the system more simple, which would make it more transparent for students. One of the non-financial barriers we talked about earlier was that students don't understand how this works. I mean, right now, and if the president's new income-driven repayment plan goes into place, students on average will pay back 50 cents on every dollar that they borrow. That's a tremendous subsidy and makes college really affordable, but people don't know that because this is hugely complex and you have to read some random research paper to know how that works. So there's a lot to be gained from simplification, but politics is standing in the way.
That we just, in the previous panel, and I guess it's appropriate that we're in this building to talk about the ways in which our broken political process is impeding work in this area. I mean, there was a desperate attempt to try and give Lamar Alexander a going away present, and Patty Murray worked with him very hard a few years ago to try and deliver some kind of meaningful legislation, and they largely failed. And if they couldn't do it, hard to imagine it happening. I don't know. I don't want to be a downer, but that's the thing. There is that's why we end up with this mousetrap. With the sort of description.
I'll be the optimistic one here because I think that higher education finance is at a headline issue like it has never been before. So we see presidential candidates now campaigning on issues of higher ed finance, whether it be debt cancellation, free college. I really think that politicians are coming to the table on this issue in a way that I haven't seen in at least my 15 years of working in this space. So maybe I'm naive, but I am hopeful that there's a chance for meaningful reform.
I would say they're eager to learn as well. So there have been a number of members on the Hill who want to do something, and they're actually willing to admit they don't know enough about the system, and they don't want to be incremental. They want to come in. They don't want to blow it up. Maybe a few do, but they do want meaningful change. But they need to hear from the folks on the ground who have been on institutions, who work with students, who study this stuff, to help educate them on the best path forward, where there's actually broad support. And so I think if we can focus on some of the most purple issues that can start to turn the tide on borrowing, that create space for experimentation, that both, on the conservative side promote self-regulation and directedness and agency and personal investment, and then pair that with a smart use of public dollars with that private investment, then I think you start to bring folks to the table. And Doug, I mentioned to you I would share one model, and this is that feature of the states. Earn to Learn, it's a nonprofit in Arizona. They're a matched savings plan. They leverage public and private dollars to match individuals' personal investment. Their outcomes are phenomenal. Students who use this matched savings program, and it's a mix of federal, state, and philanthropic dollars, their Pell outcomes are close to 80%. Most of the students who go through this program graduate with no debt. And the colleges that are participating in this program have incentives to drive down the cost and keep that cost low to make college more accessible for these learners. I think it's a model that we can look to see if it's possible to scale, but I think we need to look to more of these models where it is a public-private partnership and investment.
If in any kind of meaningful re-envisioning, what are the elements of the historical and current system that must be maintained and what ought to be jettisoned?
So one of the things I was going to say is that the dollars alone are not what get students to completion. It also requires support for students in terms of their understanding of college, their being able to navigate college. So the wraparound supports are critically important. And typically, the wraparound supports only come through programs that are discretionary, like the Title III programs, the TRIO programs, et cetera. And so if we can make those sorts of programs a little bit more ubiquitous so that all students are able to access them who need them, then I think we're going to be heads and shoulders above in terms of trying to get students through college, because giving them the dollars alone does not help them to actually see their way through college. So that's what should be kept and expanded. In terms of what should be jettisoned, I would just say that, again, the complexity of it all, it should almost be where students are able to just walk in, and because of either their tax status, their status as a citizen, et cetera, allows them to access financial aid. It should just be easier. And I think if there are ways that we can think about data we've already collected on students and let that be the application for financial aid, and then have that follow them in their lives through college, I think we'll be better off.
Beth, you.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I think de-risking the system is really important. I'll expand on that a little bit. Higher education, whether it was designed to be initially or not, has become the primary mechanism for social mobility in our economy. So it needs to work as one. And so for me, even as the one who's, less keen on spending tons of money on unnecessary things, I want to make sure that there's a safety net to ensure that people are not left behind or left worse off than where they started with education. We have moved in that direction. It used to be if you borrowed for college, you would have to pay it back or you would die with that debt. We have changed that system kind of quietly and incrementally over the past decade, such that now everybody who takes out a loan has the option to pay it back based on their income. So if you end up being a low earner after you've made an investment in college, you're not going to pay back those debts. So I think we need to embrace that model more fully, such that this is not a risky thing for students to engage in. And the simplicity is critically important, because the notion of risk and all of those things I just discussed are complex. But we need people to feel that this is something that's affordable to them, and that it's not going to make them scared that they're going to be left worse off than where they started.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say three things I think we should jettison right out the gate. The Grad Plus program. Grad Plus is effectively an unlimited lending program for graduate students, which has led to very, very costly programs. So we need to rein those incentives in correctly. Get rid of that program, because if you allow a student to borrow $100,000 for a master's, an institution's going to charge $100,000 for a master's. Mm-hmm. So let's eliminate that program off the bat and force institutions to compete on cost and not just chase the available subsidies. When students sign up for their first loan, they're signing a master promissory agreement in their financial aid award. Oftentimes they're doing it once, and then every year that award is just the financial aid award, which it's often not an award, it consists of loans. So we need to provide more transparency there for students so they know that a loan is not a grant, it's couched as a grant. And so also force institutions to have that conversation with students every year. Before we're going to award you more loan money, you need to sign that master promissory note again. You can't just sign it once when you're 18 and then for the next 6 years accumulate debt without even actually knowing you're accumulating debt. It is, again, couched as a financial aid package, and to a student, you think that's a grant. Until you graduate, next thing you know, you're $100,000 in debt. And I think that's criminal.
Yeah, several years ago, I did some survey research, and I aimed to intervene with a set of college students, get them to better understand how much they were borrowing to pay for college. And I walked into the financial aid office and sat down and suggested this intervention, and the financial aid officers laughed, and they said, they don't even know how much they're borrowing for college. So the fact that you think you're going to refine this knowledge is crazy. So to me, that's just further evidence of the fact that we have this system that is so complex that even people who are currently navigating it have like a very loose grasp on the trade-offs that they're actually making that are very consequential for their futures.
And they don't show them every year after you've borrowed for year one, year two, what is your cumulative debt today? So that makes the proposition more risky when you realize, oh, I've already borrowed $50,000 and I'm going to have to pay this back. If you don't know this, they forgot about how much they borrowed last year or the year before. And so when they come out with $100,000 of debt, they're shocked and surprised,
Yeah.
but it's not their fault, it's our fault as a system.
And the institutions have no incentive to help students borrow less either.
Right.
Right now, institutions can't limit borrowing. Congress needs to change that. But also, institutions, they're not on the hook for any of these funds. So they get their money up front, and that student graduates. The institution got their $100,000. If that student doesn't pay it back, the institution realizes no harm.
I was pretty proud that we got most of the way through without mentioning the term triad, which is the the federal government, the accreditors, which we've talked about a good bit, and the states. And I guess I just wanted to bring in for a last couple minutes a sense of sort of the state role in here and whether there are approaches that, because the states pony up a lot of money also they do for institutional money, but they also provide some student financial aid. Beth, I just wanted to get your sense of sort of potential ways for that interaction to help this system.
This is a tricky one. So historically, states were the ones largely funding their public institutions. We've seen over time a disinvestment from the state level, but at the same time an expansion of federal spending on student financial aid, largely through the lending program. And so this is a dance that the states and the federal government have been playing and will continue to play, and will be a product of the policies that we put in place. As we expand spending at the federal level, there has been proposals to do matching requirements for state spending. Steve may know better than me what's on the horizon with that work, but I guess I'm a bit more agnostic about where the money is coming from, as long as we're spending it efficiently.
Well, I mean, the federal money, the increase in the federal money has also led some states to pull back,
Right.
which is also, but so I guess that's the thing is, are there interactions that we might encourage or to between them Steve, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think we need to look more at is states and the funding that they provide has so much more flexibility in terms of the types of pathways and education that they can fund. If we want to focus more on competencies than credits, let's start with states, because the sticks that come with the state funding are much less than the sticks that come with the federal funding. And so where we see states like Idaho, for example, that really want to experiment with new models, they're using their state funding, not any federal dollars, for those new in-demand, sort of kind of aligned credentials. I think a key thing that we ought to keep on the radar, though, is as this new federal loan program and the income-driven repayment program becomes the reality for this next class of borrowers, where most borrowers will have more than 50% of their loans forgiven, and it becomes this de facto grant program, states will look at that and say, it's okay for us to disinvest then. If what we can do is effectively tell our students and tell our institutions encourage federal borrowing, when we know that most students will not have to pay that back, states can disinvest those state dollars and say, let's put that onus on the feds. And you counsel your schools and your students to borrow knowing it will be forgiven. I just can imagine all the misaligned incentives there with that type of plan.
We are just about at time. I want to thank Beth Akers, Yolanda Watson-Spiva, and Steve Taylor, and thank all of you for listening and for your time.